David, I did my doctorate in neuroscience many decades ago, and I've enjoyed over the last several decades to see more and more uh, serious scientists recognize that they're going to have to come up with different kinds of theories other than what I dealt with, the neurophysiology, neurochemistry of the cerebral cortex, to figure out what consciousness is. From your perspective, as a philosopher, a scholar of theology, how important is to discern what the deep nature of consciousness really is?
Well, how important is it, since it is everything for us, we have no world but the world that comes to us in consciousness. It seems like it should be the most important question of all, perhaps. And it's one I've been engaged in for the past few years, especially, so it seems exceedingly important to me. But I think that it does provide the most significant and most communicable problem with a simple materialist reductionism, a simple reduction of all phenomena to mechanical physical causes. In part, this is because the mechanical picture of nature is originally a picture created by removing mental phenomena from our picture of nature and the distinguishing marks of the mental. But also because when you undertake a scrupulous phenomenology of conscious acts, you find qualities that seem to be impossible to reconcile with the purely mechanist or physicalist or whatever we're going to call it picture of the natural order. And sometimes, perhaps these things should be obvious because consciousness is obvious in the sense it's something we all do. But precisely because it's so obvious, precisely because it is everything we do in a sense, the problems aren't always immediately obvious to us.
Well, look, let me, in the specific aspects of the brain, you take out a certain part of the brain, you lose that function. And so this is something that nobody denies, absolutely certain, that you have this very high correlation between being able to see in a certain part of the brain or being able to feel in a certain part of the brain. So on its surface, there looks like there's a direct correlation.
There may be a direct correlation, but correlation and causation aren't exactly the same thing. And the phenomenon of consciousness is different from the capacity for it, logically speaking. I don't think there are any pure Cartesians out there. There may be, but those who really think that there's a soul substance that's so ontologically distinct from the material that it really is just sort of like an alien inhabiting a house when it enters the body. But that said, the question is not whether, as material beings, we require this apparatus to function properly in the use of consciousness. It's whether consciousness can emerge from that physical state, either phylogenetically or neurologically, whether the consciousness is. And there you encounter all sorts of problems, and problems that more and more tend to be acknowledged now, both by philosophers of mind, but also some very canny scientists who are interested not just in the question of cognitive correlation, but what consciousness might be. Christoph Koch, the famous neuroscientist, is a good example of someone who's moved from, I wouldn't say naive, but a very optimistic hope that one could derive a picture of first-person consciousness from the third-person narrative of neurological events, and has come to embrace a different picture because he felt that the project simply wasn't going to yield the results that he had hoped for.
So Christoph and Giulio Tononi with integrated information theory on the one hand, and then the, shall we call them the panpsychic group, which seems to be expanding their
actually, those two are one and the same.
No,
I
don't think so.
Yeah, well,
in some sense, we're all one and the same. But I think they're quite different.
Well, you see, I'm going to disagree with you. No, because actually Tononi and Koch are not, by their own account, providing an account of where consciousness comes from. They're providing an account of its intensity, its cumulative presence in ever more complex systems.
Sure.
But they assume that the consciousness is already a property of physical states. Koch has become more and more like a panpsychist in describing the presence of consciousness as a brute element of nature, which then, in ever more integrated systems, becomes ever more capable of information states.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think there is a difference between the panpsychists, who I would think Dave Chalmers, Galen Strawson, would really invest every aspect of reality with some consciousness, whereas the information integrated folks would have consciousness be kind of an additional aspect of reality in some n-dimensional space or some non-Hilbert, some kind of space that has their own characteristics to it. So it's a reflect. The point being that both are very extreme positions, and John Searle would be amazed that this could happen. And
neither of them is the most extreme on offer, because there are also the eliminativists, who with varying degrees of adventurousness will deny the existence of consciousness at all.
Right.
Paul and Patricia Churchland, who believe that all talk of conscious states, including talk of beliefs, will, even anything that we would associate with personal identity or personal motive, can be reduced to fundamental biochemical descriptions, and then even perhaps to atomic.
You see, I would think that is, I don't agree with that, but I think that's a coherent position, where some of the other positions that try to create a physicalist interpretation of consciousness, I find more problematic. What about so-called non-reductive physicalism, which still tries to be materialistic, physical in terms of explanations without anything non-physical, but claims it's non-reductive to kind of deal with the issue of consciousness?
Well, you've got me, to be honest, because those who talk about non-physicalist reductionism have never been able, in my mind, to make a sufficiently coherent case for the aptness of that designation. So I wouldn't, to me, if it's not reductionist, it's not physicalist. Either one is claiming that consciousness is the physical result of physical processes, or one is claiming something that can't be fit into that physicalist picture. And if it's non-reductionist, then it becomes a story of magic. The notion that properties can emerge that have no continuity with at least the calculable properties of its ingredients is not an explanation of anything. You simply say, well, we put enough of these things together and then something happened, and then we have conscious minds. It's not it's not physicalist. It just refuses to acknowledge the fact. However, I disagree with what you just said. I don't see eliminativism as a coherent proposition. I just see it as the nuclear option if you've given up on.
Well, maybe that's the same thing.
Well, there's a kind of coherence in absolute destruction, but I mean, look at what conclusions you're led to there. It means that there's no such thing as real intentionality, that there are no real things as interior qualitative states of consciousness. Right. You have someone like Alex Rosenberg, for instance, is an eliminativist at the end of the day. He's a philosopher who's sort of an evangelical atheist too. And he understands that this involves saying that there may be no such thing as intrinsic intentionality. Well, that would mean that even the words he's putting on the page, he's acknowledging, don't mean anything. But he says there's an illusion of intrinsic intentionality. But an illusion of intrinsic intentionality would be intrinsically intentional, because what you imagine you're reading there is actually an intentional experience. I mean, it doesn't even rise to the level of a vicious circle. So, I would disagree with you. I think eliminativism is taking the emergentist narrative to such an
But
extreme that it almost parodies.
Why I think it's coherent is that it recognizes that if it allows you to have real consciousness, it's not going to be able to explain it, and therefore it has to eliminate it.
Right.
So it recognizes that. A lot of people don't recognize that.
Right. Well, that's why I say I like the extreme solutions, because they openly acknowledge, if nothing else, the difficulty of accounting for consciousness in physical terms. Eliminativism says, I have a model of reality, and here's a phenomenon, a rather conspicuous phenomenon, that is conscious existence, which we all share, which doesn't fit the model. Reason, scientific rigor, philosophical rigor would usually say, well, if you have a phenomenon that doesn't fit the model, then you eliminate the model. However, if the model is the picture of reality to which you've committed yourself come hell or high water, then you've got to eliminate the phenomenon. And in this case, it's a hell of a task, because this phenomenon is phenomenality as such. It's the entirety of all experience and all of its discernible properties. So, I mean, I guess that's coherent in the sense that that a psychosis is coherent internally. I just don't see it as a philosophical or scientific proposition. On the other hand, panpsychism doesn't actually answer the question it pretends to answer, because it simply defers it to the atomic level. You still have two qualitatively different realities. If you were using Kantian language, you would say one is nomological, a mechanistic deterministic order in which one physical event inevitably produces a certain physical result. The other is teleological, or pathological is the term that Kant would use. It's capable of qualitative intuition and intentionality. And we see that at the macroscopic level, these things seem to be in contradiction if we want a grand unified picture that's materialist. And I don't see how it answers things simply to saying, well, it goes all the way down to the atomic level. Atoms possess this qualitative thing called consciousness. And what it would mean to think of consciousness as something that could be a property that exists in greater or lesser cumulative states, rather than, I don't mean greater or lesser intelligence, but just how it could add up to the simplicity of consciousness from these diverse proto-conscious causes, I think is rather difficult to imagine.